You should know that Mr. Valoukas' report revealed that there was no conspiracy by the corporation to cover up facts. In addition, the investigators found no evidence that any employee made a trade-off between safety and cost.
The announcement by General Motors CEO Mary Barra that the company is ceasing production in the United States and shifting operations overseas came as a shock to the American industrial landscape. It was a moment that captured not only a significant shift in corporate strategy, but also a telling reflection on the increasingly tumultuous relationship between U.S. policy and global trade. At the center of the storm was newly elected President Donald Trump, whose swift decision to impose sweeping tariffs on key trade partners sent ripples through the economy, causing both immediate and long-term consequences that companies like General Motors could not ignore. Before we begin, please hit the like and subscribe buttons for future updates. General Motors, a symbol of American manufacturing for over a century, has survived global competition, economic downturns, and technological advances. Its factories have been vital to cities such as Detroit, Flint, and Arlington, employing tens of thousands of people and serving as economic anchors for entire communities. So when Mary Barra confirmed to stakeholders, employees, and the general public that GM would cease production in the United States and relocate manufacturing operations overseas, the message was seismic. It wasn't just one company making a tough decision. It was a clear indication that the economic landscape in America was changing beneath everyone's feet. The rationale for GM's move stemmed from the rapidly changing cost structures caused by the newly imposed tariffs. Tariffs, which were intended to punish foreign nations and protect domestic industries, had the opposite effect. They made it much more expensive for international buyers to buy American goods. This resulted in a sharp drop in competitiveness for companies like General Motors, which rely heavily on both imports and exports to fuel their business models. GM's global sales are a critical source of revenue, so remaining competitive internationally is unavoidable. The new tariffs, while framed as protective, served as shackles. Car manufacturing requires a complex web of suppliers and parts, many of which are sourced from different countries. A single vehicle may include components from Mexico, Canada, China, and Europe. The new tariff regime had an impact on almost every aspect of that supply chain. The cost of parts rose dramatically, as did the final price of GM's vehicles. This price increase was not lost on international buyers, who quickly began turning to other automakers that were not subject to these price hikes. European and Asian competitors gained an advantage in key markets where American vehicles had previously held a dominant position. GM was forced to confront a shrinking global footprint, not because their vehicles were inferior, but because they had become financially unaffordable. From a business standpoint, continued production within U.S. borders became unsustainable. Despite the patriotic symbolism associated with Made in America labels, businesses live and die on profit margins. If the cost of doing business domestically makes products uncompetitive in the global market, decisions must be based on economic logic rather than sentiment. With declining sales and investor unrest looming, GM's leadership determined that relocating production was the only viable option. This decision had enormous implications for the American labor market. GM's factories have long been important sources of stability for the working class. Generations of families have relied on the company to provide consistent wages, health benefits, and pensions. The closure of U.S.-based plants resulted in the displacement of tens of thousands of employees, many of whom had spent decades with the company. Entire communities built around automotive manufacturing suffered economic devastation. Businesses that relied on a consistent flow of GM employees, restaurants, shops, and service providers, faced an uncertain future. The move also signaled a deeper structural shift in the global economy. The United States was once regarded as the foundation of industrial power, and its manufacturing capabilities may have been unparalleled. That status has steadily eroded over the decades, but the GM announcement was the tipping point. It was a direct admission that, in the face of protectionist policies, globalization would not retreat. It would simply move. Countries with lower costs, fewer trade barriers, and more hospitable regulatory environments became natural destinations for GM's relocated production lines. Foreign governments saw an opportunity and began courting GM with offers of tax breaks, infrastructure investment, and labor flexibility. The company's move benefited nations in Asia and Eastern Europe. New factories promised job creation, economic growth, and integration into a prestigious global supply chain. For GM, the decision was not simply about surviving the present. It was about ensuring the company's continued relevance in the coming decades. While many saw tariffs as a nationalist move to protect American jobs, their effects produced the opposite. Rather than increasing domestic employment, they encouraged multinational corporations to look elsewhere. GM's shift highlighted the paradox at the heart of such trade policies. Rather than erecting a barrier around American industry, they forced businesses to completely circumvent it. The idea of a self-sufficient industrial America clashed with the realities of a globalized economy in which borders are porous, capital is mobile, and supply chains span continents. Mary Barra's leadership during this time became a case study in navigating complexity under fire. Balancing corporate responsibility, economic necessity, and public backlash is no easy task. Her announcement carried the weight of history and the pressure of national attention on her shoulders. However, she demonstrated through her actions that a company's primary obligation is to its viability. Though painful, the decision to leave the United States in search of more economically viable regions was not taken lightly. It reflected months of analysis, forecasting, and difficult discussions about what GM would require to remain competitive. Within political circles, the announcement sparked heated debate. Critics of the president's tariffs cited GM's move as evidence that protectionism fails in a modern, interconnected economy. Supporters, on the other hand, contended that such decisions were short-sighted and that businesses should bear short-term pain in exchange for long-term national benefit. However, GM's decision did not occur in isolation. It was being echoed in other sectors. Aerospace, agriculture, and technology companies were all expressing concerns or making similar changes, whether through layoffs, relocation, or sourcing changes. The pattern was distinctive. American consumers would not be immune. The relocation of production meant that domestic manufacturing's cost advantages, such as shorter delivery times and potentially lower prices, would erode. The final products would now face new logistical challenges, including international shipping fees and the uncertainty of cross-border regulations. Delays, backlogs, and new forms of red tape would almost certainly affect the availability and pricing of General Motors vehicles. The broader auto market would be reshaped, with repercussions reaching suppliers, dealerships, and financing institutions. Furthermore, the psychological impact on American workers was significant. For many, General Motors was more than just another employer. It was a representation of national resilience, blue-collar strength, and the American dream in action. The announcement challenged the symbolism. Workers who once proudly wore the GM badge now faced a harsh reality. Loyalty and legacy provide little protection from the invisible hand of market forces. This realization is likely to dampen enthusiasm in the industrial sector and may prompt a reevaluation of career paths, education, and labor expectations across the country. Even as it looked abroad, General Motors had to deal with domestic political and social fallout. Layoffs sparked protests, legal battles, and calls for federal intervention. Congressional leaders requested emergency meetings, while governors from affected states attempted to negotiate directly with GM about plant preservation. But the economics were unyielding. Tariff costs had already been incurred, and reversing them, if that was even a political possibility, would take time that GM could not afford. Other automakers were paying close attention. Ford, Chrysler, Toyota, and Tesla all reviewed their own supply chains, manufacturing locations, and strategic assumptions. The precedent set by GM reverberated throughout boardrooms and executive suites. If America's most iconic automaker can make such a bold move, others will undoubtedly follow. The risk of a cascading effect in which multiple manufacturers reduce or discontinue domestic production became very real. Global markets also absorbed the shock. Investors revised their expectations for not only GM, but the entire U.S. manufacturing sector. Wall Street reacted with volatility, unsure how to interpret a future in which American businesses could no longer rely on predictable trade conditions. Foreign stock exchanges, meanwhile, welcomed the prospect of new investment inflows and corporate partnerships. The balance of economic power appeared to be shifting gradually. At the heart of it all was a fundamental question. What role should the government take in shaping industrial outcomes in the 21st century? The GM decision brought that question to the forefront in an urgent manner. Should the government use tariffs and penalties to direct the economy, or should it promote flexibility and competition? The findings of this particular policy experiment appear to indicate that forceful interventions without a comprehensive understanding of global supply chains may result in counterproductive outcomes. As GM prepared to break ground on new facilities abroad, the focus shifted to the future of American manufacturing. If the old model, based on large domestic plants and vertically integrated supply chains, was no longer viable, what would replace it? The shift could spur innovation in automation, smaller-scale manufacturing hubs, or new domestic competitiveness policies. However, such transformations would require time, coordination, and a commitment to economic realism over political posturing. The message conveyed by GM's move was both stark and undeniable. In a global economy, nationalism and trade policy frequently come at a higher cost than their intended benefits. Mary Barra's decision to relocate production was not an act of defiance, but rather of adaptation, a survival strategy in a volatile policy environment. It served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of economic policy being driven by slogans rather than data, impulses rather than strategies. GM's international expansion reshaped not only the company's operations, but also the national discussion about the future of American industry. It revealed the fundamental contradictions of modern capitalism, as well as the delicate balance between domestic pride and global pragmatism. The consequences would play out in boardrooms, political arenas, and household budgets for years to come. However, one thing was clear from that single announcement. If the era of American manufacturing dominance hadn't already ended, it had just crossed another irreversible threshold. The announcement by General Motors to shift its manufacturing operations outside of the United States, prompted by President Donald Trump's new tariffs, sent shockwaves not only through economic sectors, but also deep into the societal and geopolitical fabric. With 2,400 words already dedicated to dissecting the immediate event, its foundations, and early consequences, the sequel must broaden the scope. The broader implications for diplomatic relations, industry strategy, corporate psychology, environmental policy, labor realignment, education reform, and technological adoption are complex and often overlooked. Understanding the full scope of what GM's decision triggered entails looking far beyond job losses and tariff figures. Diplomatically, the event strained relations between the United States and its major trading partners. Countries affected by tariffs were not passive observers. Many saw the measures as a direct challenge to multilateral trade agreements. Retaliatory tariffs were imposed on American exports, further limiting international opportunities for U.S.-based producers. GM's decision was interpreted internationally as evidence that even American companies could not navigate the new administration's policies. This shift became a point of contention in trade negotiations for European and Asian governments, putting additional pressure on Washington to reconsider its position. It served as a powerful anecdotal weapon at diplomatic summits, reinforcing the argument that aggressive protectionism can backfire on even the initiator. Diplomatic relations with the United States became more complex in countries where General Motors announced plans to expand or establish new manufacturing facilities. On the one hand, these countries welcomed capital inflows and job creation with open arms. On the other hand, they acted cautiously, aware that such corporate migration could exacerbate tensions. Host governments had to balance their enthusiasm with careful messaging to avoid appearing to benefit from America's economic missteps. For them, receiving GM meant recalibrating their future relationship with an increasingly unpredictable superpower. For the auto industry as a whole, GM's decision forced a rethinking of long-held assumptions about where value can be created and how risk is assessed. Traditional models based on national stability and government alignment had to account for unexpected policy shifts. Automakers began to value geopolitical risk, policy volatility, and the growing influence of populist economic platforms. Companies across the sector began quietly developing contingency plans, predicting that the United States would no longer be a stable long-term manufacturing hub under certain leadership trends. Plant diversification, supply chain redundancy, and the development of multi-continent production systems became not only desirable, but also necessary. Corporate boards, influenced by GM's bold strategic shift, began rethinking the cost-benefit models for domestic loyalty. Executives who had previously opposed moving operations offshore due to reputational concerns now had a strong precedent to point to. GM's stature shielded it from public outrage. If it can make the transition and survive, maybe others can too. The normalization of offshore migration triggered a chain reaction. Suppliers, smaller OEMs, and even software firms involved in vehicle production began to take emerging markets more seriously. The strategic map of innovation and component manufacturing was redrawn. Beyond economics and diplomacy, the social narrative underwent significant changes. The working-class American identity, once inextricably linked to factory jobs and physical labor, was experiencing a crisis of continuity. With GM gone from their communities, people began to wonder what roles remained for those who were not part of the digital economy. It was more than just a loss of employment, it was the destruction of a way of life. Cultural pride, family ties, and community cohesion, which were often based on long-term manufacturing jobs, began to fray. Suicide rates rose in some towns, mental health services were overburdened, and substance abuse increased, all as a result of a decision made far away in a corporate boardroom. Educational institutions, particularly those in industrialized areas, faced pressure to adapt quickly. The old pipelines, which linked high school shop classes to factory apprenticeships, were broken. Enrollment in vocational schools fell despite rising demand for retraining. Colleges struggled to shift to programs that could replace traditional career paths. Automation engineering, logistics management, and AI-driven production design became focus areas, but the transitions were slow and underfunded. Meanwhile, many older workers found themselves too far along in life to retrain meaningfully, resulting in a generational divide. Younger people left these towns in search of better opportunities, leaving behind hollowed-out neighborhoods. Environmentally, the decision to relocate production created new and complex issues. Deindustrialization in the United States may result in lower emissions from major plants, but it is not guaranteed to be an overall environmental benefit. Moving production to countries with laxer environmental regulations threatened to increase vehicle carbon footprints due to longer shipping routes, more energy-intensive practices, and fewer emission controls. Furthermore, the offshoring of pollution, rather than its reduction, raised ethical concerns. It enabled wealthier countries to claim environmental progress while shifting the burden to less regulated economies. In response, environmentalists began advocating for new types of agreements: carbon tariffs, green certification for multinational corporations, and border-adjusted emission taxes. These proposals sought to hold companies such as General Motors accountable not only for their finished products, but also for the entire manufacturing process. Consumer advocacy groups advocated for labeling systems that would disclose the carbon cost of manufacturing, with the goal of creating market-based pressure for cleaner operations regardless of location. The long-known but largely ignored environmental cost of globalization has been reintroduced into public discourse with renewed urgency. Meanwhile, the technology sector began to play a larger role in automotive manufacturing, filling the void left by the departure of traditional players. Companies that had previously operated solely in the digital realm began to explore physical production. Some proposed hyperlocal microfactories that would use 3D printing and AI to build cars closer to customers, eliminating the need for international shipping and large-scale assembly lines. Others advocated for modular vehicle platforms that could be quickly adapted based on location and regulations. These innovations began to sketch a different future, one less reliant on centralized production and more focused on distributed manufacturing enabled by software, robotics, and agile logistics. The financial community took notice as well. Investment strategies started to change. Previously, U.S.-based industrial bonds and equities were regarded as relatively safe, particularly in sectors such as automotive. Investors began demanding higher yields to offset political risk. Credit agencies revised their ratings to reflect the uncertainty caused by rapid policy shifts. Hedge funds began to speculate not only on commodity prices and consumer demand, but also on the possibility of trade shocks and retaliation. The financialization of policy risk has evolved into a specialized field, with GM's move frequently cited in presentations and prospectuses as a case study in modern market volatility. Within GM, the relocation effort sparked a corporate transformation. Managing operations across multiple legal systems, labor codes, and currencies necessitated an increased level of internal complexity. Departments needed to be restructured. Talent pipelines needed to be rebuilt in other countries. Executives were deployed abroad to oversee the launch of entirely new facilities. These changes, while logistically challenging, also marked a cultural shift within the company. A more internationalist mindset took hold. Corporate loyalty began to shift away from national roots and towards global efficiency. Over time, this could reduce American cultural influence within the corporation, shifting its internal values and public image. At the same time, the U.S. military-industrial complex was quietly watching the developments with concern. Major automakers such as General Motors have historically served as contractors and strategic partners during wartime or national emergencies. Their domestic presence has been viewed as a form of soft national security. The ability to shift auto plants towards tank production or ventilators, as happened during COVID-19, was dependent on domestic infrastructure. The relocation of these assets abroad meant that, in the event of a crisis, the United States would have fewer options for rapid response. Defense planners began to reconsider the risks of over-reliance on global supply chains, even in non-defense industries. Insurance companies, too, have responded. Global risk models needed to be updated to reflect the changing nature of production. As General Motors expanded its operations into politically diverse regions, the risk of labor disputes, natural disasters, and geopolitical instability grew. Policies needed to be revised, premiums adjusted, and exclusions reviewed. Corporate insurance became a more complex, expensive, and important piece of the puzzle, particularly in industries as vulnerable to macroeconomic forces as automotive. Culturally, the move prompted reflection in the artistic and journalistic domains. Novels, films, and investigative series began to emerge, focusing on the lives left behind in GM's abandoned locations. Stories about laid-off workers, struggling single mothers, repurposed factories, and urban decay captivated the American public. These works did more than just mourn the past. They questioned the values of a society that had failed to protect its most devoted workforce. Museums curated exhibits on the history of American manufacturing, framing it not as a continuing story, but as an era that had ended, possibly prematurely. Unions faced an existential crisis. They were once a cornerstone of worker protection, but now they are weakened and divided. Some advocated for nationwide strikes or appeals to international labor organizations. Others attempted to rebrand themselves as transition partners, offering retraining and advocating for modern labor rights. However, many workers became disillusioned and abandoned organized labor entirely, feeling betrayed not only by corporations, but also by institutions they had long supported. Union membership fell even further, eroding a political force that once influenced national elections and legislative agendas. In the political arena, the GM announcement sparked heated debates. New candidates running on either pro- or anti-globalization platforms took advantage of the opportunity to highlight their ideologies. Think tanks released white papers, each interpreting the event through their own lens: free market necessity, populist betrayal, and neoliberal inevitability. For some, the decision demonstrated that only a completely new economic model could address emerging 21st century realities, one in which automation, global mobility, and digital trade have replaced smokestacks and assembly lines. The global educational discourse has also evolved. International business schools began updating their case studies to include GM's move as an inflection point. Students from Shanghai, Berlin, Johannesburg, and Sao Paulo investigated the implications not only for business, but also for ethics, policy, and human geography. Global CEOs in training were now being taught to think beyond national loyalties and operate in a world where strategic flexibility was the only constant. Even among consumers, subtle but significant shifts began to emerge. Some people became more aware of where their products came from. Others, disillusioned with traditional automakers, turned to startups or foreign brands. A growing number of consumers began to advocate for ethical manufacturing certifications, urging automakers to disclose factory conditions, wage standards, and environmental impact. Though they remained a minority, Their voices added to the pressure on businesses to see relocation as a path with new forms of scrutiny and responsibility, rather than an escape. Although GM's announcement was corporate in nature, it had far-reaching implications for almost every aspect of modern life. It exposed the fragility of industrial ecosystems, the speed with which policy can reshape corporate behavior, and the extent to which national identity is linked to economic production. The move was more than just a business decision. It was a watershed moment in American history. While GM's machinery may continue to hum abroad, what it leaves behind in the United States is more than empty buildings and pink slips. It leaves a profound question. In an age when capital flows freely, but people and places are tethered, who bears the cost of progress? The answer could take generations to fully unfold. The ongoing consequences of General Motors' strategic shift away from U.S.-based manufacturing reverberated across unexpected sectors, escalating existing tensions in American economic philosophy, institutional trust, and the cultural narrative of national identity. With each development that followed Mary Barra's announcement, a broader landscape of consequence emerged, one that included education, regional politics, urban planning, generational divides, corporate governance, and even psychological resilience among the American workforce. In state capitals and municipal governments throughout the Rust Belt, GM's decision sparked a wave of policy rethinking. Cities such as Lordstown, Toledo, and Janesville have invested significant public funds over the years to keep large manufacturers operating within their borders. These funds frequently came in the form of tax breaks. Infrastructure support and utility subsidies are calculated risks to ensure stable employment and economic multipliers. With GM's departure, many of these sunk costs became effectively unrecoverable. Local governments were left with vacant industrial parks, budget deficits, and underutilized public services. Public officials came under fire not only for what was perceived to be poor foresight, but also for putting so many economic eggs in one corporate basket. This prompted a broader reckoning on economic diversification at the local and state levels. Civic leaders began aggressively courting startups, logistics hubs, renewable energy firms, and digital service providers in an effort to diversify the economy. The transition, however, proved difficult. Many of these towns were designed for heavy manufacturing, not data centers or biotech labs. They lacked the broadband infrastructure, technical workforce, and academic collaboration required to pivot quickly. It became clear that replacing an automaker's economic footprint was not a one-to-one exchange, but rather a generational challenge requiring a complete overhaul of urban and regional planning. Urban decay in many Midwestern towns, which was thought to be gradually stabilizing, has accelerated again. As property values fell and shopfronts closed, the visible signs of economic decline increased. Graffiti, abandoned homes, increased crime, and failing schools became common features of the post-GM landscape. Local law enforcement and social service agencies, already overburdened, were unprepared for the surge in demand. The decline in civic morale was more than just an economic issue. It was emotional, psychological, and generational. In the private sector, GM's actions had another unintended consequence. It upended the long-standing hierarchy of corporate patriotism. For decades, some businesses had built their reputations on their dedication to American workers. Companies that kept their operations in the United States were frequently praised as moral counterpoints to those looking for cheaper labor overseas. GM's move shattered that perception. Suddenly, even American industry icons were shifting to prioritize shareholder value over public sentiment. This encouraged other companies to reconsider their own public image. Corporations that were previously hesitant to move offshore now see themselves as simply adapting to a precedent set by the very company that once represented national manufacturing strength. These cascading effects reignited debate about the role of antitrust policy and the power of large corporations in shaping political discourse. Critics argued that GM's enormous leverage enabled it to accept public subsidies for decades before abandoning its responsibilities when the economic winds shifted. This fueled calls for more stringent controls on corporate commitments linked to public funding. Economists and political commentators revisited clawback provisions, which are contractual mechanisms that require companies to repay public incentives if they fail to meet agreed-upon employment or investment duration benchmarks. Foreign competitors capitalized on the global auto industry's recalibration, Automakers in South Korea, Germany, and Japan quickly launched marketing campaigns emphasizing pricing stability and manufacturing continuity. In emerging economies where GM expanded operations, such as Vietnam, India, and Eastern European countries, competitors positioned themselves as more stable long-term partners. The global landscape of automotive power began to shift subtly, with a repositioning of which countries held the keys to production influence. Meanwhile, the GM exodus had an impact on not only workers, but also small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs, that were part of the company's ecosystem. Tooling companies, parts manufacturers, logistics operators, and maintenance contractors that relied heavily on GM contracts saw their revenue virtually disappear overnight. Many of these small and medium-sized enterprises lacked the necessary capital or diversification to survive the loss. The closure of a single large plant frequently resulted in the dissolution of dozens of smaller businesses in its orbit. Government bailouts were rare for these companies, and their options for pivoting were limited by scale, specialization, and geography. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us what you think about GM shutting down U.S. production due to Trump's new tariffs. We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.